culture or matrilineal. So my friendships identify in different my great with the continual of who I am. So I like to identify myself in that way. As I mentioned, I'm Navajo. I'm originally from a place called White Horse Lake, New Mexico, which is about 13 miles east of the Chaco Canyon Monument, National Monument. So I like to call that the deep res. So I grew up the first years of my life with my matrilineal grandmother and grandfather. So English was my first language. Get a formal education and go to college. And so I'm kind of one of those good sons, if you will. But I grew up also in Little Rock, Arizona, and now currently reside in Denver, Colorado. But I do consulting work, and I also do work in traffic courts and traffic judges as my 9-to-5 job. And I was telling a friend, I'm trying to retire out of public health, but it seems really hard to be able to do so. But very honored to be here. I also want to acknowledge the land I'm on, the Cherokee people, as well as the Shawnee people that work there as well. So very sad. So this presentation is understanding Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ identity for the clinical setting. So as a part of, next slide, please. So as a part of the presentation, I'm going to hopefully help you all learn a little bit more and give you skills to utilize, your locations within your programs. And some of the objectives, they gotta have learning objectives, right? So these are some learning objectives, and hopefully by the end of this hour that you have with me, we'll be able to achieve them. Talking about the complexities of Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ issues, explain how American Indian Native identity, which includes Native Two-Spirit LGBT issues, may be associated with access to healthcare, and then explain how identification with Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ identity may be a protective factor in holistic health and well-being, and then describe how to foster safe and inclusive clinical experience for Native LGBT. I'm going to be saying the acronym a lot today, so hopefully I don't get too bombarded. Next slide, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ. How many of you have heard the term Two-Spirit? Oh, wow, a lot of you have. Oh my goodness, that's great. Usually when I do this presentation, maybe one or two hands go up, but it's a good indication that this understanding and this concept is being introduced into our communities, particularly in our own Native communities, right? And these are just some pictures of my good friends that I have up here. Buffalo Barbie, who I live with, who lives in Denver as well. Tony Inos, who's Cherokee out of Philadelphia, and Bean, who just got married and had their first child. I'm so proud of them. And then my big good friend, who lives in Phoenix, or Vanessa, I'm sorry. So just wanted to share some photos of individuals who also identify as Two-Spirit. Next slide. So since a majority of the room know what Two-Spirit is, I'm just gonna, it'll be a good reintroduction for you, if you will. So Two-Spirit is a term that was adopted in the 1990s at the third international gathering, Two-Spirit gathering. These gatherings happen every other year internationally, so it goes between Canada and the US. They just had the 30th international gathering in New Brunswick last week. The First Nations Two-Spirit community hosted that 2 years ago. And at that particular gathering in 1990, some of our knowledge keeper older folks who also identified as Native and LGBTQ were sitting around a fire and talking about terms that were utilized to identify ourselves, such terms as berdache, right, which is really offensive now if we think about it, or if we define it. Berdache is a French term that was used by anthropologists to describe Two-Spirit people. The translation of that term means a cat boy, the male whore. To use the term bluntly, right? So it's very demeaning. So at the cider, they were talking and said, we need to come up with a term for ourselves. And even LGBTQ kind of doesn't describe Native people as the way we feel and understand. So they came up with this term two-spirit, which is an English translation of an Anishinaabe word that describes individuals who have a feminine and a masculine spirit, right? So it's more about spirituality and cultural understanding and not necessarily physicality, right, as an American. And I often like to say, oh, I'll say that a little later. So it'll stick with you, I hear it often. But just explaining that concept a little bit more between American, Western understandings of LGBTQ and the Native perspectives of two-spirit people. But it was a contemporary term that was accepted at this gathering. And so hence then, since 1990s, the term has been introduced in our community. I myself identify as two-spirit as well. So I identify as Navajo, first and foremost. Secondly, I identify as two-spirit. Thirdly, as a gay male. And typically, a lot of Native LGBTQ individuals associate themselves more so with their cultural identity than their gender identity or sexual orientation. From conversations I had, that our Native identity is central and important to us first and foremost. It took me a while to identify as two-spirit, only because culturally there's some connotations that I'll explain about, particularly as a Navajo gay male, but then also the roles and responsibilities I had to accept. I've been 17 years sober, so that was a part of it. Thank you. Part of being able to accept what my role is in the community and as a role as a two-spirit person, responsibilities. So I now accept that term. I don't use that term when I go back to the reservation because when I go back, when you translate two-spirit into Navajo thought and language process, it would mean to have a good spirit and a bad spirit. Not necessarily the connotation of feminine and masculine. It's more so about the good and bad. So I don't use that term when I go amongst family or on the reservation. I use the term neglect, which is our term for an individual who identifies as a gay male. In not every community utilizes the term two-spirit, only because of those connotations, those definitions. So I often say the two-spirit term is a self-identifying term, only because people might not have that understanding or they do culturally, but then also some people aren't ready for that discussion, like I was. So there's a deeper meaning for the term two-spirit. Oh, next slide. I like that. Two-spirit is not a term that can be used by non-native people. Right? I oftentimes have my non-native relatives who are also LGBTQ come up and say, "Oh, girl, I'm two-spirit." No, you're not. Like, only because I talked about the cultural responsibilities that are associated with this term, that if you're non-native, you won't understand that. Right? So your identity is not associated with, the cultural aspects of it. So, if you're not native, don't use the term. My more progressive friends say, don't, what was that term? Don't take our term. Don't appropriate our term. Right? English not my first language. I'm only having my second cup of coffee. But yeah, so a non-native brothers and sisters, please understand that there is a role and responsibility to the term. And it's not a term used by all tribes, or adopted by all tribes, right? As I mentioned in Navajo, not a lot of my relatives there who identify use that term. In different communities, it's very different as well. But on the flip side of that, it can also be a positive, quote unquote, reinforcement for individuals. Because at the time when this term was introduced and when I heard it, I was living in Los Angeles, running an HIV prevention program, and I ran the support group. And individuals who lived in the urban area, like Los Angeles, utilized and adopted the term because they really felt that connection that they may have been missing as a Native person, and also as an LGBTQ person. So some individuals, that can be an empowering term for them as well, right? So next slide. So there is some cultural history, cultural understandings for the term Two-Spirit. It's used in many rural and urban communities to describe the retaining of their own traditional identities and culture. As I mentioned, my clients from Los Angeles really took to the term, those who may have been adopted out or who may have left the reservation for whatever reason. It really instigated their want, their need to find a cultural identity. So that's the beautiful thing about it. And even for me, someone who's been out for, I used to play with Barbie, so I love the movie Barbie. I used to steal my sister's Barbies. But for someone like me, it took me time to accept. It took me some time to understanding of what my role was going to be. Always an auntie, not an elder. That's my new thing. But I'm personally, I'm in a transition in my life, but now I see myself as that older relative who holds this knowledge. It's a very interesting experience, particularly as a Two-Spirit person. Oh, now I have responsibilities. Girl can't hang out till 2 o'clock in the morning anymore. She will be up early with the sun, right? For me, I'm also in an interesting place in my life personally, but the term has given me publicly, when I say I'm Two-Spirit, the community knows that the younger ones have their advice, and I'm really seeing that change in aspect in my own understanding. Next slide. So historically, as I mentioned, there are some stories that are still told. There's the identity that is still understood from our communities. For instance, our Lakota relatives in South and North Dakota utilize the term wingtip for someone who identifies as a gay male or Two-Spirit person. And as a part of their culture, they set out a wingtip person to do a naming of a newborn, right? Because they feel that a wingtip individual has a higher spiritual connection to the Creator as of their identity. So families would seek out a wingtip when a newborn was born and allow them to come to ceremony to give them their traditional name. And that was a story that was told to me, but it's also that was a story that was reaffirmed to me at Two-Spirit relative. So to this day, this practice is still going on. And it's a very honored tradition that not a lot of folks know about. And even within the Lakota, it's kind of being lost. So there needs to, we need to have an understanding of who's playing the roles as well. But that's an example of how that, particularly in that tribe, how Two-Spirit wingtip person is a part of that ceremony, which I think is beautiful. And then for Navajo, sometimes our stories also are included in our history, our creation stories, right? And so Navajo, we have a story about the Negley, the more effeminate males, which was part of our separation of sexes. So these stories can be 4 days long, that we tell in the winter, or they can be the abridged version, which I'm going to give you because I don't have days. But the abridged version was told to me by my elder aunt, who became my grandmother. But when I was a teenager, she told me of this story that, and that was kind of the first time I heard which from Medway in my family. Oh, they're calling me a Medway. Okay, and I felt that honor. But as a part of that, the story was that during our creation story, the males and females had a disagreement. It was a big conflict. So the females went on one side of the river, the males went on one side of the river. And it was the Negley, feminine males, the less masculine males, that went across the river and went to the females and said, we need to live, we need to get over this conflict that we're having, we need to procreate so our people can continue. So in that regard, the females accepted us, and now we're the great population. But it was the non-queer people that were given that ability to negotiate. And it's interesting because now one of my characteristics, even within my own family, is to settle disputes, like to be that negotiator. So I see that as kind of my role as a two-spirit person, to be that negotiator, right? And it reflects that telling of the creation story. And so that's not taught a lot as well, right? That separation of sex. And there were a lot more details to the story, using deer horns to satisfy themselves. So you can get really graphic. But then when I was in college, I did my own research and found some stories that kind of were the same as my family told me. So in a lot of our cultures and traditions, we have those stories that exist that have this third or fourth gender, third or fourth gender, fifth and sixth gender. So we had a diversity of genders before we were. And each of those genders were more so about responsibility, not necessarily procreation. And then after European contact,
You say responsibilities, or you're the wrong. You can see that.
yeah, sure. Your role in a community, so, in American society, if you're a husband, what are you expected to do? Work, fix the car, take out the trash. As a female, you're taught to wash dishes, cook those things. And traditional native people before colonization, our roles included doing a little bit of both, right? It wasn't so defined. So those are roles and responsibilities. Carrying of songs, ceremonies, participation, those are roles and responsibilities that as two-spirit people have. That's what we're given. So certain songs in our community are only supposed to be sung and heard by two-spirit. So that's our responsibility. It wasn't so binary. It wasn't so restricted. And it wasn't until American society came that it became restricted. And these roles were only for me. These roles were only for me. Now when I go back to the reservation, and we're celebrating our summer ceremonies now. And I just had a friend text and post on social media. Oh, all the queens are here. We're all cooking and laughing. And this is ceremony. In queens, I mean LGBTQ. And that's practice today, but that space is for us. There's no disagreement. There's no name calling because we're all there for the community. And so it's interesting to see that post from my friend. Oh, we're all cooking because that's our role. We make some good fried bread, let me tell you. But then on the high side of that, I participate in the summer ceremonies. I cook, but then you'll also see me hauling wood. Also see me getting water, helping the men with the horses, and in those spaces that was so it was interesting. So when I go back home to the reservation, participate in ceremony, that renews my energy as a medical person, right? So being able to participate in ceremonies is great. Next slide. Okay. So languages. To me, if a tribe had a language or a term for a two-spirit person, native LGBTQ person, to me that's evident. Why would we make a book? Right? So these terms, this is just a handful of terms, describe individuals who may identify as two-spirit. Crow use the term bote, which is more so gender is male. Navajo use the term nagle. And then for female now we have a term delba. Delba. Ba in Navajo language means warrior. So if you're given a Navajo name with a ba, you're considered very strong and maybe a little bit more masculine. Lakota, as I mentioned, use the term workday. Zuni use the term lemana. Tongva, my good friend Daniel, our relatives. Tongva is a cultural group in Southern California. And I had the opportunity to visit with a knowledge speaker there who gave me these terms, Wekayakan, which is more so for two-spirit, male and female gender, and Kuya, which is specifically, and I know that I'm yeah, make the slide. It's for a transgender individual. And I included that in my list only because that was the first time I heard a specific word for a trans person. I thought that was amazing. You know, to find that position, that identity within the community. And Tom was an interesting type of community because they're not state, they're not state or federally recognized yet. And they were missioned by the Catholics a lot. So to have this knowledge keeper have this term meant to talk to me. Wow, this is passed down. This is great. So I include that term because we know we have terms also for our trans relatives as well. Anyone who is of a tribal nation here have a term in their community?
I'm not part of a tribal nation, but I'm from Hawaii.
Okay.
Native Hawaiians use the term mahu
Yes.
or mahuahine or mahukane, in case they were female or male oriented. There's other further names to delve deeper for transgender individuals too.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I love the term my good friends apply. It's mahu magic. You know, so our relatives, our indigenous relatives also have. You know, I believe Pakafine.
Someone.
Yes, Samoa also have. But for me, language is important. Language gives us quote unquote credibility. Right? Like I said, why would we make up a term if there was nothing there? So we know we existed. You know, we knew there was a place. So language is important. So this goes, I want to expand my here. This goes to the world here. So I created this with a good friend of mine, Maddie Jim, who you might have heard last year, who was at our conference here. But she's, you know, she identifies as a native trans woman as well. And so we created this slide just because we get questions. How does it equal? You know, because we're so ingrained in this Western American understanding of biology. Right? When you're born, what color balloons do you get? Pink or blue, right? So that's sex or birth. Gender identity, female, male. Gender expression, how you appear to present yourself, feminine and masculine. Sexual orientation, gay, hetero, bi. The fact that you're just women or men and women, right? But in a native perspective, it's more fluid. And I love that term fluid because I'm like, hey, that was so native when they started talking about gender fluidity. I'm like, hey, that is it. So there's some connections there too. But for a native person, a two-spirit person, it's more fluid. You know, your sex at birth, we don't give blue or pink balloons. It's usually, oh, and a lot of native tribes don't want to know the birth until the baby's born, right? So when a baby was born, there were ceremonies, but they would even have a bow or a basket. And so they let the child pick their own gender, you know, in that way. There were ceremonies that happened. So it wasn't so, oh, woman and no female. And then native identity, which we are, and then gender expression, feminine, masculine. We have ceremonies and dances where individuals who are biologically male but wear female failure. It's how it's the balance. We provided that balance. And then gender roles that I mentioned. Right? Provider, hunter, healer, caregiver, cook, healer as well. Right? So those were all interchangeable. It wasn't so one side of the spectrum to the other. And this is where I'll say, so in American society, we're more concerned of what you do outside your teepee. Native, we're more concerned of what we do inside your teepee than what we do outside your teepee. We have sodomy laws, right, in America. People identify you by who you sleep with, you know. Whereas in the native communities, it's outside your teepee. What do you do for the community? How do you participate in something? How do you present yourself? That's also key for it. You know, I see our Native Two-Spirit people dancing in powwows. There's a way to wear regalia. It's how you present yourself. Right? Being caregivers, taking care of children, being their adoptive parent, right? Taking care of our elders. You see a lot of Two-Spirit have those roles. So it's more so about what you do outside the TV or what you do inside. Next slide. And are there any questions?
I wanted to just, like, it's more of an observation. I was thinking, it was really interesting how you had like the linear representation and then the circular representation, because the other thing that sort of came to my mind is that seems very similar to also the differences in how time is represented in a Western versus Indigenous view, which it just feels very closely connected to what we're talking about. So I felt like I couldn't just look at the images and not show that.
Good. And I hope it helps with that understanding. And yeah, we talked about time. Do we talk about gender? So hopefully that was it. So, oh, next slide. So these are just some of individuals I often like to mention, historical relatives who are passed on, but who also identified openly in the Native LGBT. The first is Wewa, who was from the Zuni Pueblo. I'm going to use the term she. She was a cultural ambassador and caretaker, and she would have been someone we would probably consider a transgender woman at the time. But in Pueblo society, she was referred to as a lemana, because she had that essence of being female and practiced those roles as well. She was a leader in the Pueblo. She got to go to Washington, D.C. She met with President Cleveland, the First Lady, had lunch with the First Lady, and they didn't know she was trans. She was buried in her maka, her female regalia, as an honor by herself. And if some of you know the Zuni Pueblo, they're one of the 11 pueblos out near Mexico, but they're one of the most sacred pueblos. Like they won't even let other native people. And I know that firsthand. I go up, I'm like, oh no, you're not welcome. Turn around. But I also got to visit the museum at one point. When I learned about Wewa, and I asked about her to the museum, to the museum curator, and just some questions. I heard about Wewa. How is she in the Pueblo? How is she viewed? Where is she buried? And boom, stopped the conversation. And he said, we don't talk about her. She's gone. We don't talk about her anymore. She was scared. She was very powerful. We don't talk. And I kind of felt very like, because she's felt to be that safe. So the question about her passing kind of was like, to me as an outsider, but also to other native, just a person. But I found that not interesting, but I found that very powerful because of how she was held in reverence and still is today. So she is one of those individuals that I also like to highlight. Oshkish was Crow. Their name was Finds Them and Kills Them. And even used to pronounce that. Hey, just kidding. But they presented very masculine, was part of a warrior party. I don't know if they were the ones that helped kill Hester. They were part of that warrior party. So the roles of a warrior was for Oshkish. And then Hussein Claw was Janae, Navajo as well. She was a big queen, I'm telling you. A celebrated weaver, a traditional healer. Hussein Claw had many sheep, which showed our wealth in the community. He often traded with the trading post around New Mexico. There's stories of where he had relations with the traders that he traded with, as well. And then was a great weaver. Wove these rugs in Navajo culture, which was more of a feminine task per se. But had this ability, because he was Nagley, to weave these rugs that we call Yeti rugs. So they're like stick figure rugs. I don't know if you've seen them, but those are our deities. Yetis are our deities. And so he was given that ability to weave that image. That spiritual connectedness. So you'll see a lot of his work in the Wheelwright Museum, the Heard Museum in different places. Simply was given that ability. So very skilled hands. Next slide. Now let's see if it's the video will work. But this is just the video I'd like to show. It's like 1 minute, but it's just an overall. It kind of just captures everything we've discussed so far. And we'll have a little discussion.
All of the cultures talking about this. It feels like boxes and you into. What is working from is that passing on, stories that allow for people to learn about each other, to appreciate each other, to live in a way that everyone felt like they were safe and belonged. Just
Like
Yes.org.
ingenuity. But just a couple of questions. You heard my presentation about identity and also the video, but just a couple of questions before we move on. Describe American Indian or Alaska Native notions of gender identity or sexual orientation before. Describe any notion.
I mean, I didn't really know what it was, and what kind of term I was like familiar with. But from my understanding, from what you're saying, it's not necessarily like gender based, but responsibility based. Where you have this confined to one certain role, you have the ability of being able to participate with other where you're participating.
So with, it is defined by roles of the cultural roles. Yeah. Whereas now in the, now after colonization or before colonization, we had those, or after colonization, you know, we're giving those specific roles. Washing dishes is always for.
Although I like pulling trash myself and pulling noise.
Dishwashers. Anything else? Any other comments?
Well, and this is the western part that you say gay, you say lesbian, it has like a stigma. It has like a bad connotation, but then you hear two-spirit and it's beautiful, it's empowering, it's, wow, this person is special.
Yeah, you can view it that way as well. You know, I think in American society, we come to a point where the LGBTQ is something, you know. And so there is some stigma that does.
I think it's just really another example on how colonization and first contact used any kind of native identity and empowerment and saw that as a more spiritual and higher thing. And so they wanted to target that, so that that was just another way of disempowering the native people.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there was an article that was written, there was this actor or this celebrity that identified as two-spirit, right? And he was a part of tribal nation. He got a lot of backlash about it, but he thought it was a cool term to use. He didn't know the history of how the, didn't know the history as well as the term itself. I can't remember the name, but I remember that. But you're right. Are there some words used by the storytellers to describe the understanding learning about two-spirit identity? Any of the words from the video that may have described their own learning about identity? You know, I think there was one guy in there who said, or one person in there who said, oh, I didn't succumb to the term, but now I know the term, right? You know, so that can help them. And I think that's what, you know, I think the context of the video is more of an urban setting too. You know, in San Francisco, so there's more as well. And then why might gender pronouns not necessarily coincide with all two-spirit LGBT? But there's this new, why should I say new?
Oh, well, you mean like,
Yeah.
how you identify that way, but when you talk about, the outside, it doesn't give you that little bit of this, little bit of that, it's, you're either he, she, or, you know, she, or he, him. Not that,
Not that middle ground.
that,
that
that.
they-
fluid, but it's more-
Yeah.
Sometimes more feminine than male.
Yeah, correct, yes.
It reminded me of the video when she says like she felt stuck with how people felt within the boxes. And two-spirit feels like she's free or they're free, or however they identify themselves, as being able to traverse through the boxes, within the boxes and outside the boxes, and to be free to express themselves.
Yeah, definitely. So the boxes really contain us, right? As well, you find us in this understanding. But even the, you know, and I think you know, in terms of pronouns, you know, in traditional societies, we didn't have these identifying pronouns. They were interlinked or interused. In Navajo, our language, our pronouns are nifit, nifit, shit, nifit, which is more possessive pronouns. They have, they give, I give, you know, and it wasn't necessarily based on pronouns. The Spanish language, though, is based on, you know,
Oh, yeah.
feminine and masculine.
Very
stuff.
gender
So
oriented,
it's
yeah.
very different in that culture. But the pronoun is the issue. But the pronoun usage in tribal communities is a give and take. And I think it's generational as well, because a lot of the older ones are like pronouns, we didn't use pronouns, that's colonized. But a lot of younger folks, you know, artistic people, that gives them their identity as well in the context of who they are. So I often say it's generational. Again, it's self-identifying. You know, it's always how the client wants to be referred to. And then I often get the comments sometimes when I'm presenting, but what if I use the wrong pronoun? To just apologize and say I'm learning. I had that happen one time with an Uber driver. I'm telling you, and I should know this, right? And I just felt really bad. Oh my God, I made this mistake, and I had to call my friend Maddie. I was like, girl, I was like, I misgendered my Uber driver. They were really upset because they do apologize. Yeah, she was you know, it's okay. You know, you're learning too that it's still a process. You know, wear stickers all the time. Yeah, that's the male, female, you know, all that. So it's self-identifying. And then you'll get some of those older native two-spirit crews. Yeah, but my and then even on the res, like when I go back, we call each other girl, we call each other she, you know. And then it's kind of interesting now. My older aunt, she's always called my gay friend she, right? And I hear, I'm like, oh, she's learning, she knows, but that was just her concept because they presented it. You know, and my older aunt, she doesn't speak English at all. Well, maybe just a little now. But yeah, so it's just generation. Okay, yes.
I feel like a lot of things come down to respect, right? And so sometimes, you know, we don't get it quote unquote right every time, but when we show the respect to try to learn and to move forward in a better way, so we can do right by
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. And the native communities, like all of you know, the majority of you work with a community. That's essential. That's respect and trust. Right? Yeah. Okay. Next slide. I'm just looking at the time. Okay, gotta go. So just some health outcomes for artistic native LGBTQ individuals. Next slide. Wanted to give some statistics, but that's the challenge in our community. There's not a lot of research or statistics that include native and LGBTQ. It's often segregated, well, just native and then LGBTQ. So some of these stats kind of give that inclination. So we're kind of going to talk about two aspects of holistic wellness, one being mental health. 28% of our native people have a mental health condition, which is really concerning, as well as our LGBTQ youth, who are 2 or 3 times more likely to commit suicide. Our native transgender respondents who participated in the survey, 46% of them had psychological distress. Among transgender individuals generally, there was 41% who attempted suicide. Amongst our native transgender individuals, there were 56%. There are higher levels of stigma about mental health in our communities, right? Something to be viewed as bad in a way, which has to change as well. And then also racism, bias, transphobia, homophobia, discrimination often are experiencing such treatments of infection. As I mentioned, there's not a lot of studies or research done on native LGBTQ individuals, except for this one I quoted here, which is part of the US transgender survey that took a lot of advocacy. So they specifically targeted native transgender individuals. And that's how they were able to get some amazing stats. So there needs to be a movement where we do more research amongst this particular community, because we know that these numbers are still high. Right? So hence data is really important on your clinical setting, right? To be able to report that. So it all kind of correlates together. A clinical tip for mental health is to provide culturally sensitive mental health services should reflect native traditional health and healing practices with possible referrals to trusted and understanding. Right, so having that understanding of your client, knowing the term true spirit is also important. I put the last part as a clinical tip because sometimes we refer clients into traditional health services, right? If they want, often they'll say, don't put someone in there if they don't know what to do. So for instance, a sweat lodge. We've been having this conversation in the Two-Spirit community, something that's going on called skirt shame. So for some tribes, they have two sweat lodges, male and a female. And the person who runs the lodge oftentimes tells individuals who are Two-Spirit to go to the lodge that is reflective of the biological sex, and that they have to wear a skirt if they're female. Now that can have a devastating effect. Can traumatize the individual again, and speak spiritual cultural services, but it's important as providers to make sure that if you're referring clients to traditional healers or traditional teachings, that they're also understanding of native LGBT issues. So make sure that they're trusted individuals. And I say that because I've had that happen to a client. A great guy, trusted him, but he was really adamant about one of our trans individuals not wearing a skirt, right? So you have to be very, very careful when you're referring these kinds to traditional practices. So, yes.
So I'm having a difficult time like framing my question, but I'm gonna try to get it out. How or what are some recommendations that you would have for individuals who are working in a clinical setting or prevention setting with youth who may be self-identifying, but there may be a conflict in terms of parental acceptance? And so even like when you, like if you have a youth that comes to you, and so you're looking at like suicide numbers, even like collecting that data could be a barrier if you're not even able to reach, like reach that child, or in terms of accessing services or resources geared to that youth, if there's maybe like not community acceptance or parental acceptance of how they're choosing to identify, it almost is just kind of like you're waiting for some of these statistics to happen.
That is a very good question. I would say if your services allow for families to come in together, maybe have that discussion collectively, because ultimately you want to help that individual. So if the family is supported, that's great. If they're not, then that's something you need to be, right? So hopefully bringing in the family collectively, to work with them through this. And then allowing the individual, the client, the youth, to pick what services. A lot of times our youth are not well versed in issues, right? So that might not be good, right? But assessing that I think is important. I know it's difficult when you have, they need parental consent and all of that. I would focus on what's beneficial to the youth at the time, and allow them to express themselves, bring their family together, maybe bring an additional person in there if need be, just, give a lot of input. But do that type of, not necessarily wrap around services, but allow them to express collectively, and not just talking with you. Hopefully that answers them.
Questions related to that, our services are more so group-based and on that, meso level. We work in the after-school programs, and anytime the even potential of any kind of LGBTQ issues comes up, the parents instantly shut down and are like, nope, going my kid out. So do you have any advice on how to even remotely overcome that barrier?
I guess that would be situational as well, but I think just, as Native people, if we bring it back to the concept of culture, I think that might help in a way. So asking them Do they know the word? Do they know someone in the community that might know to help through this understanding of what it is to be two-spirit or who is two-spirit? And just that conversation about, have you heard the term? You know, or even as a clinician, look up the term for the community that you serve too. Because for most tribes, unless they were, for most tribes, there should be a tribe.
I have a question related to that. Which is, so I'm a member of the Shakur and Shakopee tribe of South Carolina. And so like, I come from first contact people. And so because we were contacted so early on, the intensity of the cultural destruction left a lot unreported. So that's something I don't know if you have any good answer or way to speak to that, but that is definitely like a challenge that I see on the East Coast.
Yeah. And I can definitely understand that. I mean, even on the West Coast of the California trades, missionization took away a lot of the culture. Talking with the cultural elder, the knowledge keeper, you know, like I mentioned, the guy from Tonga, like I just talked with him and that just building that trust, you know. Or related to a tribe that's nearby, right? Cherokee Nation. And I know it's tough in the South because I was in Oklahoma presenting one time and I was talking about sexual health. Oh, God. Wondering why everybody's eyes were just like assertive and bottoming and stuff. You know, the South has this religious connotation. So there's always going to be a challenge as people's understanding. I always bring it from a spirituality aspect. We're all spiritual beings. Organized religion helps you express. Native communities, ceremonies, drums, but we're all spiritual. So I kind of contextualize that in that way that we're spiritual. And that's just our expression. Hopefully I answered your question a little bit.
Kind of adding on to what you just said, and it's just kind of a personal query. Because of the current political and possibly like past political climate, especially towards transgender individuals, how receptive have your talks been to people when you travel, just in general?
Oh yeah, they've been positive.
Okay.
You know, and it depends on location.
Yeah.
But even then, I mean, even going into some communities like, you know, that are very cultural, I can see some of the older individuals, their eyes. But it's interesting because in a group setting, they won't ask the questions, but then when I'm alone, they'll be coming over. Hey, no, my uncle's that, you know, or they're like that. So it's situational as well. But I find the South and just the current political climate really hard. I was just in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and some of the conversations we had with the two-spirit folks is something I, as a Native person, would think about, particularly around ceremony and stomping. How they're disallowing two-spirit people to go to stomping because the cultural leader at the Stomping is also Christian. So it's influencing decision making. So, you know, those aspects are so happening. Yeah. Okay, we have 5 minutes. We're going to go on really quick. Thank you. Great questions, great conversations. I like the talk and learning. Physical health. You know, HIV is amongst our community still. 81% is amongst gay or bisexual men. 36,000 natives had HIV in 2006. 82% of them have received a diagnosis, which there is still 80% that don't have their diagnosis, which is concerning. The care is going up. I think this is over 50% now. This is 2007, so we're really doing good on getting some care diagnosed. Our urban LGBTQ natives still experience discrimination and related to their health. Native transgender individuals have reported 65% have been reported being sexually assaulted. 50% native transgenders have reported having a negative health. According to the healthcare, and that is a range of a range of issues. One thing I want to mention about physical health is that we're talking about a gay and bisexual men. There's one population in there I also like to talk about, which are non-gay identified men. Kind of like how in the Black community, it's the GL men that came out several years ago. Now it's our native men, that behavior shows that there's a high risk for native gay men as well as even our trans women. My friends back home call them six-pack boys. Give them a six-pack. So that's another complication. Next slide. Transgender health. 50% of our transgender respondents have a healthcare experience. 37% didn't seek healthcare due to fear of mistreatment. 49% who showed ID that didn't match gender were verbally harassed and unbenefit. And amongst our native transgender, 56%. One of the clinical tips for clinicians working with trans clients is not to ask about the person's genitalia. Like one of my good trans friends said, it's about what's between our ears, and not between our lips. So I'm not coming to you for any physical issues with the genitalia. And it's something to consider for trans women, prostate, breast exams, heart, hormones for trans men, pap smears, hysterectomies, and pop surgery. Okay, next slide. All right, making your place a little safer. Safe zone training. How many of you have been to a safe zone training? One, yay! Okay, we need more hands to go up, if you will. But safe zone training is really good to have for your organization. It just really, the meat of the training is just to be able to look at your own bias. How you as a person, we all have biases, but just training highlights your biases of this LGBTQ. I even have my own biases. I put in my phone, oh, you're an internalized homophobic. I'm like, no, I don't think so. It's like bring dresses. Training is a good training to have. It's online if you want to take. There's a few of us that are wanting to adapt this to be more culturally specific for natives, so hopefully we'll be able to provide that soon. But the sticker is also an indication that your space is safe. You have a board, your desk, a rainbow, anything like that. A native LGBT. Oh, they know. They're allies. Good relatives. Right? So I just encourage you, safe zone training. You can go to safe zone training, safezoneproject.com, and it's all free. Some issues, some recommendations on your physical space. Put up posters, rainbow. Rainbows mean different things in tribal communities too. Can mean pride, but also like in Navajo is sacred, balance, harmony. So a lot of natives like rainbows, so make sure it talks about pride, LGBT. Have a gender neutral restroom. That's an important issue. I always say, traditionally, our house didn't have men and women restroom. We all used the same one. It's like the same pole. So, and it is an issue. We don't think about it sometimes, but particularly our cis relatives, that just going to the restroom. That's a big impact. I had a trans client that didn't go to the restroom for almost 2 days because of the security. I was afraid that they would out and they said, don't. I'm like, no, you could get a UTI. So it really is an issue. Produce marketing that's relevant to our native two-spirit LGBT issues, languages, imagery, hire a workforce that's congruent with the population that you serve. So, making sure you have individuals who identify as two-spirit. Well, next slide. Your clinical intake form, sexual orientation, gender identity, make sure they're revisit it, see if it's working, include those in your intake. As I said, data is important. Data helps the research, which helps the funding. Funding helps our people, right? So it's all interconnected. We talked about insurance, pronouns a little bit. You can just ask what pronoun, gender pronoun do you prefer? And then yes or no, and then what they prefer. Or you don't want to ask them. Preferred name. You know, this is always an issue, particularly for our trans clients as well. You know what, name what they like to go by, even if it's not on their ID. You know, respect the individual. It's fine. But just make sure that they, you know, that you're being open to that and letting them know. Recommendations for clinical interviews, maybe wearing a pin, so, in your white coat, a rainbow ally. Ask questions that are appropriate in the interview for the clinical exam. You know, use open-ended questions, and there's an example. I want to make sure we're respectful when we talk. Coming out and we like to use how to keep culture, if any, impact maybe your gender identity, or sexual orientation. That's a good question as well. And so learning about how to best serve my LGBTQ patients. Let me know how I can do that. You know, just gaining that trust and respect is also so using open. All right, and these are just some resources. The Portland area Indian Health Board, I'm sure you all know them, work with them, the USET, West Coast. They have an amazing LGBTQ spirit program. They have beautiful imagery that you can print out. You know, and they have some great resources online as well. Indian Health Services is doing an amazing job. You all know Rick Havercake, who's doing a lot for our community at IHS level. So they've been really supportive of our communities. And then one last thing I wanted to, do I have it in here? Oh, we're not. Oh no, I don't have it in here. It was out of Evergreen College. Toolkit, the Two-Spirit Equity Toolkit. I'll add it to the slide so you can send out. But it's a great toolkit. It talks about same-sex marriage. It talks about tribal policy, how to do all that. It's an amazing, it's like a 3.0 version. And they may have documents you can download too. So it's the Tribal Equity Toolkit. And then just to end, we are opening up a national TNTA center soon, called the Two-Spirit Native LGBT Center